Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Bajer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
And so what happens at that below the surface level? Well, what that means is that you know exactly what your culture is, and that's where you start. And you know where your culture is because you got below the surface. How did you get below the surface? Well, you were able to help your leaders be real with their employees, relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. So anything that you had going on in the background around separate inclusion strategies, that's all in leadership. You're also helping your leaders listen better. And when they listen better, they're able to access empathy. And when they're able to access empathy, you're able to kind of discern how people are doing in an organization. I call that person to belonging listening, and that's part of empathy, empathetic listening. And it's like when you can take a step back and look around and see how are your employees interacting? Who seems left out? Who seems preoccupied? That's another way to get below the surface. Instead of staying at the surface and just having team rules and how you do things, take a step back and just observe.
Hello, and welcome to episode 86 of the Culture Lab podcast. So before we start, a quick note on current events. The war that is currently raging in Ukraine. It's so hard for me to wrap my brain around this situation. It's 2022, and yet we have another senseless, brutal, unthinkably inhumane attack on a sovereign country where ordinary civilians are paying the ultimate price. So I think it's important that we say our team stands in solidarity with our Ukrainian friends and the whole Ukrainian nation. And I'm saying this on the show because public opinion matters. When we take a stand publicly, we are putting pressure on our governments to take action and do whatever they can to stop this. If you want to help Ukraine, by the way, and don't know how, there are links in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So, if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/culturebrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. And now, let's go to today's episode. And our guest today is LaTonya Wilkins. LaTonya is the author of Leading Below the Surface, a book about something that's actually quite challenging. Building real, meaningful relationships with people who are different from us. So LaTonya thought about these issues because when she was climbing the corporate ladder, she often experienced being the only one, someone who's different, someone who stands out or doesn't quite fit in. And she realized that the only way to create a workplace where everyone can thrive is through building psychologically safe relationships across differences. And often doing it in a way that is not entirely scalable, one relationship at a time. So in this interview, we talk about empowering underrepresented employees to feel valued, to feel heard, and to feel engaged, and also about creating cultures of belonging in the workplace. So without further ado, here is LaTonya Wilkins.
I'm LaTonya. I'm an author of a book called Leading Below the Surface. I also run a company called Change Coaches. And mainly what we do is we work with executive teams to create cultures of belonging through culture. And so that's a little bit about what we do.
Amazing. One question that I always ask to every single guest that we have on the show is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? How did you grow up?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I talk about this also in my book. I grew up in a small town in the US, in the state of Iowa. And I grew up in a very blue collar family. My dad was a golfer. He also had a very blue collar job. Both my parents worked. And then I spent a lot of time also in Des Moines as part of my childhood with mainly my mom and my grandma. And my grandma was just such an inspiration. She kind of instilled values in me that were around just seeing the light. Everything that happens around us, it's really useful in the most difficult of times. The light will always shine somewhere, and you just have to find that light. So that's kind of the values of around how I grew up and what that looks like.
I'm always curious, how come that it's usually our grandparents that instill values in us and make a lasting impression on our personalities? Why do you think that is? Like in your case, why was it your grandma and not your parents?
Yeah, my grandma was extremely wise, and she was just a very unique, loving person. Her great grandmother was a slave. So my great grandmother lived for a long time too. I have a lot of longevity in the women in my family. So my great grandma lived till like 98, and she didn't have the personality my grandmother had. My grandmother was raising my kids in Jackson, Mississippi, and it was during the Jim Crow laws. And my mother didn't want to comply drinking from a colored fountain. So that's when she moved everyone up north. And I think it was just that she had to go through so much, and she didn't let it ruin her view on the world, right? Like she always,
Mm-hmm.
in the times when I always was having a hard time, she just was like, "This is gonna pass. This will pass." She's like, "I lived through so much." I mean, imagine what they lived through. I mean, they lived through wars, right? They lived through
Totally.
racism. Like my grandma lived through a
Mm.
lot of racism. They lived through lots of pandemics. I mean, my uncle almost died of polio. So it just created this resilience in my
Yeah.
family. She was kind of the matriarch of all of that.
Yeah, I always love that. I love hearing these stories. And it's so incredibly fascinating to me that these people have left such a lasting mark on our lives. Because in my case, it's actually quite similar. So I had a very, very strong bond with my grandmother and with my great aunt. And they were very similar, I think, to your grandma in the sense that they went through a lot, obviously. Living through the Second World War, my grandmother was abused by her husband and eventually left him. And yet she had that eternal optimism in her as well. And she was, I think, the person who has instilled optimism in me, which is so, so interesting. So I just find this so fascinating that people who lived such a long time ago touched our lives in such a significant way. And they are still with us in a sense, shaping the way we go through life and think about ourselves and our identity. Thanks for sharing that. Speaking of the past and origin stories, I'm so curious. What is the origin story of your book, Leading Below the Surface? Because having written a book myself, I know that it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of work. And there's usually a story behind that. I'd like to know, why did you feel compelled to write this book and why are you so passionate about DEIB work?
Yeah. So, two things. One is just the story I told you around my grandma, just spreading the light in the world. And she was always really good with developing relationships with people who are different from herself, even in the hardest of times. And that was something I always admired about her. Someone told me once, "Hey, you are that too." And it's just amazing to be able to do that. Second, I worked for a long time in corporate. I climbed the corporate ladder. I led leadership development teams. I led people and culture teams, culture leader. And I saw that even though we talk about these things, culture, talent, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these programs just had limited effectiveness, right? And I knew that the secret recipe for this would be, hey, let's just build some better relationships with each other, right? I just got so frustrated over the years. I'm like, why are we spending all this money on training all these people all over the world and it doesn't do anything? It was really around first my grandma planting the seeds and then those seeds budding through me needing to tell my story. And the more I needed to tell my story, the more those seeds grew. And then I finally kind of was like bursting at the seams and I'm like, I have to write this book. And so that's when I did it. I wrote the book in about a year. And so, but I thought about it a lot before I wrote it.
Yeah, I love that description, bursting at the seams, because I think this is the state that you have to be in to make such a commitment. It's quite a painful process sometimes writing a book. So yeah, I can only imagine. So what is Leading Below the Surface? Because that's the title of your book. And I think it's a good point to start. What is it?
Leading Below the Surface is a leadership archetype. I did a lot of research around leadership archetypes, and I found that there really weren't a lot of archetypes around how we treat people, especially people who are different from us. And so that's what Leading Below the Surface is. There's three prongs: real leadership, being relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal; empathy, empathetic leadership. I'll talk a little bit about that; and psychological safety. It's using those prongs to connect with people that are different from us. Another thing I talk about in Leading Below the Surface is challenging dominant leadership standards. So leadership standards, again, that are outdated and don't serve the leadership of today or how we need to be leading organizations today with everything changing so quickly. So that's a little bit about what it is. It's a leadership archetype to connect with people who are different from you.
Yeah. And why below the surface? So what is the surface and what's happening below the surface?
I know there's a lot of culture leaders listening to this. And so all of you have probably seen the culture iceberg. And then at the top, there's values and norms and
Behaviors. Yeah.
yeah, artifacts at the top. And I think that's where a lot of us focus is the surface stuff. I'm not saying that stuff is not important, right? But that's where a lot of this starts and stops, right? Is at the surface. And the surface stuff is, hey, we have a great culture. Hey, we have a fun culture. Hey, we have a game room. Hey, we pay people a lot.
Yeah.
That's the surface stuff. And that's, again, those are artifacts, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to get below the surface, but that's where you are able to establish psychologically safe relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you're able to establish real connections. Also, if you get below the surface, that's how you understand what your culture really is and how things really get done in your organization. And again, it's really hard to do that. We stay at the surface. And again, I think a lot of us culture leaders, I know I was actually rewarded based on surface things, right? If
Mm-hmm.
I could bring in surface things like new artifacts that showed we were a good culture on the outside,
Yeah.
then that was an accomplishment. But that doesn't do when you're in the trenches. And I was an employee and I was sitting there and I'm like, this isn't touching me. Yeah, this might be touching people outside that are on Glassdoor, but
Yeah.
it doesn't do anything for me. So that's why
Totally.
I called this below the surface leadership.
Totally. So let's talk about this a little bit because many people who are listening to our conversation today will be able to relate to this. So very often, you will have a goal like, let's get on great places to work for list or something like that, right? And you see these companies who get all these accolades. And if you know them from the inside, sometimes, I'm not saying always, but sometimes you're like, what? Seriously? This is a great
Yeah.
place to work? Because actually, I have a friend and she had a nervous breakdown because of her manager. So I don't know how it can be a great place to work. So speak to this a little bit because it is an important thing to talk about. I don't think that a lot of people are aware that so much energy is being spent on those artifacts or building a brand, employer brand, and making sure that a company is talked about in a certain way. But actually, not a lot of under the surface work is being done.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because just the other day I was on LinkedIn and I saw like one of those companies and I'm like, wow. And I saw
Mm.
a person that I'd worked with before, and that person was being recognized for achieving diversity in the organization.
Uh-huh.
And I received some text messages from people that came from diverse backgrounds, and they're like, "What is this?" And I'm like, "I don't know." What's interesting, and you probably know this, culture leaders, that you could pay for that stuff, right? There's a lot of tit for tat kind of stuff out there where, oh, okay, you want to be on a top 100 list. I mean, I get this a lot in my emails. It's like, hey, you could pay to be a part of this, and or
Yeah.
you could be a top 100 in exchange for this.
For consultants as well, right?
Yeah, in exchange for some services.
Being a guru or whatever. Yeah.
Right, right, right. And it's like we are so obsessed with that stuff. But I do think that what's happening is through the below the surface movement and getting below the surface, a lot of us are able to see through that, to see through the BS. Just because someone's on the front page of a billboard and they're saying how great they are, you got to be able to see through that. And I think
Yeah.
we are starting to. I think I get skeptical every single time someone says they're on a certain list because I'm like, even the New York Times bestseller list was rigged, right? Like all of these
Yeah.
things
Totally.
are rigged, and so it's not managing for those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when you stop caring so much about being on the list, suddenly there is so much energy that is being released and that you can channel into things that will actually have an impact. And I completely resonate with your experience being a culture leader in an organization and feeling like, well, the things that we're doing, they don't actually have an impact. So there must be a better way because that has been my experience as a consultant. I work for large consultancies, not naming any names, but very often, you would do a huge project and work with incredibly passionate and committed people, by the way. But the way we were doing those things was really focusing on a lot of stuff that didn't create the desired impact. So let's go to, I think, the core of our conversation. So if those superficial things don't really move the needle in the right direction, what does? And what should we be focusing on? And where should we be channeling this energy?
I talked a little bit about this earlier this week. So the best place to work list, that takes a lot of time and energy, and you have to fill out a lot of surveys. And it's also that same way with HRC, which is a good thing to have. So what should you be doing differently, right? Because that, you could kind of come in and think, hey, if we could get a great place to work, but that's your whole year, pretty much,
Mm,
trying to fill
yeah.
out that paperwork. So what you could do is not just focus on the macro, right? Like all the things across the company, all the things are going to scale, but also focusing on the micro. And I think the micro is where we need to be focusing on. It's thinking about relationships, one on one
Mhm.
relationships. It's thinking about team relationships through a one on one lens. And I'm finding that it's not that managers don't want to do this or leaders don't want to do this and employees don't want to do this. It's just that I don't think they know how. And I think
Mhm.
the pandemic has showed us that where some people are really struggling and they bring these things to work and managers just don't know how to respond. They don't know how to support people.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do these things. So focusing on the micro and doing that, if you're thinking about scaling anything, trying to help managers scale that with their teams where they're focusing on those individual relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about this a little bit during our huddle fireside chat in the Culture Brain community, how challenging that can be for various generations also, right? Because then you have the boomers, and I guess probably for them, this is the most difficult thing. And they will come into the workplace armored and with this professional sort of facade. And then we have the younger generations who haven't really had an opportunity to practice a lot one-to-one relationships because of various factors, but they've been growing up with gaming and online relationships. And now we've had the pandemic. So a large population within the workplace is really, really not comfortable with those micro approaches and relationships. Do you have any ideas around how we can help them overcome that hurdle?
That's a really great question. And I think it's different for all the generations you mentioned. And I'm going to preface this with I hate the stereotypes, but so when I'm talking about this, I'm just saying tend to be. And when you're thinking about baby boomers, they tend to communicate in an entirely different way, obviously, than Gen Y, even Gen X,
Mm.
and then Gen Z. And so also, baby boomers, I don't think that they grew up in an environment where people bought this type of stuff to work, right?
Yeah,
That's not something that boomers do or that they've
totally.
ever had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was coached and mentored as a young professional woman, and there was this whole notion of what it means to be professional and a long list of things that you simply, as you say, wouldn't bring to work, starting from emotions.
Yes.
You're not supposed to be emotional at work.
Yeah. That's a really good example. First of all, focusing on the boomers is taking the taboo out of this, number one. And number two, again, you have to work closely with them so they can understand the generations coming into the workplace and we can understand how to work together. When you ask Gen Y and Z, they don't want to separate this stuff. You want to bring your whole self to work if you want to. And if you are experiencing a lot of trauma at home and you can't just express that at work, your performance is going to drop. And so I think maybe it's even talking to boomers about it in that way, where if we don't do this, then performance is going to drop, right? And people are going to leave. Letting them be a little bit more informed about the stuff that's going on and maybe how that might impact their staff instead of saying, hey, you got to do this.
Yeah.
Again, I just don't think that this is something that they've ever had to deal with. And I mean, the pandemic's new for all of us, but I think especially for generations that didn't grow up with technology and have never had to deal with work and home kind of colliding.
Mm, yeah, it must be hard. I love this idea about showing the consequences, right, of not really addressing these issues. And I also love the idea that Rohini Anand, our previous guest on the podcast, shared when she talked about resistance to change and how to create diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments with people who have grown up with privilege and don't understand the issues of other groups. And she talked also about finding ways to appeal to their hearts, not just to their minds. And I think that's another interesting piece. Like, how can we create emotional experiences for these people so that they can feel it as well as understand it?
Right.
Right. And I don't know what it would be. She gave like an example where she brought a French guy into an employee resource group for Black Americans. And she said it was the first time in his life when, first of all, he was surrounded by people who looked completely different than him. And he was the odd one, he was the other. And also just being able to hear his colleagues' stories and what their reality was like, it was incredibly powerful as well. And so I think that sometimes people, and it goes back to your points, right? How can you go to micro again? Like, how can you connect to other human beings? Because I think when we know people's stories and when we know them at a personal level, it immediately connects to our hearts. And so it probably has this potential to change us, to transform us.
I absolutely love that. And what that kind of brought up for me is when I was studying abroad in business school. And I was the minority in so many different ways. Americans were the minority, right? And I think when you experience that, I experienced that in my country, but it was in a whole different way. The language differences, all of that. It's like you have a certain level of humility that's kind of like, wow, everything kind of like what you just talked about with that experience. Everything is not going to go my way. And how does it feel when the power dynamics are shifted, right? And when the composition of the group is shifted? I think that everybody should have that experience where
Yeah,
they are the only one, and so they could see what that feels like. And it kind of trains you to be a little bit more vulnerable and just understand the hardships of other people that
right.
may be underrepresented in the workplace.
Yeah, exactly. And understand it at an emotional level as well, because I think intellectually we get it, but nothing compares to actually feeling it.
Right.
Yeah, so true. So let's talk about your approach to diving under the surface and cultivating a culture of belonging through taking a less superficial approach. What are the key areas that we need to focus on? What does it mean to be below the surface leader? If you can dive a little bit deeper into the details around your four-pronged approach, that would be amazing.
I have a chapter entirely focused on culture, and I talk about 3 different levels of culture. I talk about surface level when we're sitting at the surface level and we're measuring ourselves at the surface level. I talk about the middle level, which is the transitional level, and I talk about below the surface level. And so what happens at that below the surface level? Well, what that means is that you know exactly what your culture is, and that's where you start. And you know where your culture is because you got below the surface. How did you get below the surface? Well, you were able to help your leaders be real with their employees, relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. So anything that you had going on in the background around separate inclusion strategies, that's all in leadership. You're also helping your leaders listen better. And when they listen better, they're able to access empathy. And when they're able to access empathy, you're able to kind of discern how people are doing in an organization. I call that person to belonging listening, and that's part of empathy, empathetic listening. And it's like when you can take a step back and look around and see how are your employees interacting? Who seems left out? Who seems preoccupied? That's another way to get below the surface. Instead of staying at the surface and just having team rules and how you do things, take a step back and just observe. The third prong to get there is psychological safety. With that psychological safety piece, the other two, real leadership and empathetic listening, kind of help us get there. But it's one of those things with psychological safety where you also have to address some of these poisonous organizational systems that might be unpsychologically safe. Yeah, so those are some of the prongs in order to get to that below the surface level.
Speaking about psychological safety, because it's such a foundational condition to cultivate a healthy culture. And obviously, all the things that you've mentioned are incredibly important as well. But it almost seems that if you don't have psychological safety, it's impossible to have innovation. It's impossible to have a culture where people do speak up and share their opinion, where they flag issues. So there's a very, very strong business case for building psychological safety. And I always find that when there is a strong business case, people start to listen. Senior leaders in organizations start to listen more carefully to how to cultivate it. And so, speaking of psychological safety, first of all, I think you having spent so many years in organizations being a culture practitioner, like what are the behaviors that you have seen that maybe not that obvious, because the obvious ones, we all know what they are, but ones that we might miss? What are the behaviors like microaggressions or things that people do that they might not be aware of? And the reason I'm asking this question, just really quickly to explain, is I think that one of the reasons that we don't have psychologically safe environments is not because people do it on purpose. It's just that there is lack of awareness. So I'd like us to maybe, create a short repository of things not to do because they can actually create problems with psychological safety.
Yeah, I might not answer this question how you're wanting me to answer it. And I don't know if you are wanting me to answer it this way. I talked about being a culture leader in organizations. And one of the things I noticed that was holding us all back and that we were caught in are poisonous organizational systems. That's how I refer to those in the book. And what I mean by that is, how do people miss psychological safety? Well, because it's not built into their systems. And one
Right.
system that you can relate to, everyone that's listening to this can relate to, is performance management.
Hmm.
This is one of those things that got me bursting at the seam. We are like, okay, we're going to be psychologically safe, but yet in our performance management process, it's competitive. Only 20% can get this rating. Only 20% can get this rating. So it creates a culture of competition. That
Hmm.
is not a culture of psychological safety. If you are
Yeah.
competitive, you are not going to feel psychologically safe. So I think
Hmm.
that's the first thing is check your processes. If you have a performance management process like that and you can't change it as one person, as a culture leader, I would probably put it on the agenda and the roadmap to
Hmm.
change it in the longer term. If you are a manager working in this, you have to subvert that. You have to find a way to subvert that on your team so your team isn't competing with each other. And this is so common because so many organizations still call themselves meritocracies. And if you have a meritocracy, quote unquote, that is not a psychologically safe environment. That's like a survival of the fittest type environment.
Hmm.
So that's how I'll answer that. I think you first have to look at those structures and systems.
Systems. Mm.
You have to subvert them if you can't change them tomorrow. And I talk a lot about this because again, that's the stuff that holds us back is managers are complying with these things. And these are the things that the C-suite is saying is making the company better, but it's actually eating people up.
Yeah, totally. And or like recruitment, right? I remember one of the first companies, consultancies that I was hired by, I was the first person in the history of that organization without an MBA. And it was in the criteria. And actually, not only did they not hire people without an MBA, they only hired people who had an MBA from a school like, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, whatever. As you can imagine, right, as a person, I was an immigrant. I came to Greece back then from Poland. I obviously didn't have these opportunities. And so when you have systems like that and recruitment criteria like that, obviously you are missing out on creating an inclusive organization. And I think very often companies don't think about those things. Yeah.
Excellent example.
This is what I want to encourage our listeners to think about, because actually that thing about recruitment in that company was changed thanks to one individual. And he was not the HR person in that company, but he got my CV. He saw something in me that others couldn't, and he wanted to meet me. And when he met me, he was convinced that I would succeed. And he said, he was very transparent and honest with me. And he said, things are fucked up here. They only hire people with MBAs, but I think that we can, we can overcome that hurdle. What we will do is we will pay for your MBA if you are willing to go through this process. And so eventually that's what happened. So the company paid for my postgraduate studies and I was hired. And I was hired thanks to this one person. And so, yeah, Louis, actually, if you are listening, thank you again, because I think we need to, express our gratitude to these people. But that's how things are changed. And of course, then this ridiculous rule sort of dissolved and we started hiring other people as well.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I was working with a company in the UK last year and same thing. They only hired people from like Cambridge. When this client that I was coaching was hired, I mean, they were different, but they were like the best performer. And it was hard because, again, the cultural systems and structures were hard for him to navigate. And I think they also, since he was so good, they started kind of revisiting that and they started revisiting who they hire and who they consider top notch. And that is a
Yeah.
really great example. That happens way more than we think it does.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Then back to this conversation, we cannot seem to find diverse talent, whatever they define as diverse talent. But actually, when you dig deeper, you realize that companies are simply not not making these opportunities available to diverse talent and not looking also in places where diverse talent would be. So that's a good one. Recruitment, definitely, when it comes to systems, is a good place to start. Yeah, so I'm 100% with you that culture is this funny thing because, of course, people say it's like a wind or like water. It's definitely hard to grasp. And I think the only thing that we can do intentionally is to create the right environment where the right culture can thrive. And one of those things, like architecting culture, is creating those systems that, as you say, are not toxic and that will actually support an inclusive culture. So this is at the systemic level. And I do want to go back, to my question around behaviors. Like, what do you see people do in those micro interactions that is not helping in creating a psychologically safe or inclusive environment? Did you have any observations like microaggressions, things that people might not be aware of that they do that make it unsafe for others?
Yeah, I know you're mentioning microaggressions. I mean, another one that I would say, I talk about the terrible three biases in my book: affinity bias, confirmation bias, and then group bias. So there's a lot of biases around wanting to praise people who are like you, or wanting to hire people that are like you, or went to the same schools. And those people, and I talk about this person in my book, Linda, she had a ton of psychological safety because she was all those things to the leadership team, right? They had this affinity bias towards her. And so I think that's another thing is that, take out a sheet of paper and write down everybody on your team. In one column, write down how you think they're performing. In another column, write down like how similar are they to you, right? How
Mm-hmm.
similar are they to you? Do they go to the same school? So they have the same background? That stuff is important because, again, we're going to tend to create more psychologically safe environments for those people because those are the
Mm-hmm.
people that we have confirmation bias towards, and we think that they're going to succeed. The second thing I would say is, I know this sounds basic, but if you do have one-on-ones, encouraging managers to do that, but changing the way you have one-on-ones is really important for psychological safety as well. And what that looks like is leaving some time in the meetings to not just go through everything, right? Like usually in these one-on-ones, we're just going through a list. And as you mentioned earlier, just try to get more on an emotional level with people and not just like a transactional level. And
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, hey, LaTonya, what do you need? What are your tasks? I remember the one-on-ones. It was like, what are your tasks, LaTonya? How can I help you? How can I help you succeed? And that was it. But it was like, asking in those meetings, like, what's really challenging for you?
Mm-hmm.
And what else is on your mind? And
Yeah.
how can we as a team support you? And
Mm-hmm.
how do you feel about mistakes being made on our team? And how are you treated in that? And I think
Yeah.
being able to like change the way that, like, how do you want me to manage you? Like all of these questions,
Mm.
how do you want me to play my role as your manager? And see, all of these things, like, we don't cover. We just, again, we're just going through these one-on-ones that are very, very transactional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I totally agree. And I love all these questions that you have just shared. We had Michael Bangistania on the show, and he's a great guy who's written many books about coaching. And he has a list with 7 questions that managers can ask to have these deeper conversations. And the number one question, and you have mentioned it, is what's on your mind? Like it's such an open-ended question and it really opens up a conversation. He calls it, I think, the Facebook question because that's the prompt that you get on Facebook. And I think it's so great if you can just open up a conversation and see what people bring into it rather than trying to steer it, and as you say, or even worse, approach it as a checklist, a conversation where you need to check all the boxes. I love that. I think it's so important to develop that muscle of having these conversations with people to create psychological safety. And this exercise that you've mentioned about creating 2 columns and then thinking, who are the best performers in my team and why, that's really powerful. And I'm thinking really, there is this thing called the Pygmalion Effect where people who we believe are going to be successful are going to be way more successful, especially if we are in a position of power. And so I think every manager should really keep that in mind, that our belief about what our team members are capable of is going to have an impact on their performance. And if we have bias against certain individuals simply because they don't look or speak like us or come from a different background or studied in a different university, it's a problem. And we're definitely not creating an inclusive workplace. Oh, I wish that we had more time to talk, but I'm conscious of the fact that we are running out of time. So let's shift gears a little bit. We have a section on the show that is called Rapid Fire Questions. And so I have a set of 5 questions for you. And the challenge here for you is to try and answer all 5 questions in under 2 minutes. Are you up for the challenge?
Yes, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
It's a pattern of behaviors that can be seen and felt in an organization.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
If you ask 5 people what the culture is and they all have different answers.
Love that. What company do you admire for their culture, if any?
LinkedIn, I would say everybody I know that's ever worked there loves it. They actually walk the talk.
What books on culture or leadership would you recommend, aside your book that I warmly, definitely, and very enthusiastically recommend myself?
Yeah, everything by Amy Edmondson, I think. Everything by Adam Grant, I would say. And this is going to be a little bit of a different take, but I love a lot of what Ryan Holiday writes. And so Ryan Holiday's books.
Stoicism?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think those are, that's very much behavior, below the surface type behaviors. So I would say he would be my third.
Nice. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and to start cultivating the sort of culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Start with just some casual groups and asking questions like, hey, what's going on? And, what's on your mind? And what would you like to see change? And I would say not making it a big initiative, but just starting. And you could start that in employee resource groups. You could start it with certain departments or teams, but just starting there.
Wonderful. LaTonya, thank you so much for this conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, what is the best place, an online place for them to go to?
Yeah, so you could go to leadingbelowthesurface.com to learn more about the book, or you could connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm LaTonya Wilkins on LinkedIn, or Instagram at LaTonya Coaching.
Amazing. Thank you so much again. Thank you for this conversation, but also most importantly for the work that you are doing. It's much needed and I really appreciate you.
Absolutely. This was a fun conversation.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. LaTonya and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader and deeper about cultivating cultures of belonging. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with LaTonya and other guests of the Culture Lab podcast in live sessions where you can pick their brains and discuss the topics that we cover on the show, this is just one of many benefits you'd enjoy if you were a member of the Culture Brained community. So Culture Brained is one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. So if you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a really diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. But what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join if it feels like it's the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.1/culturebrained, and you'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/agabajer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabajer.com and let us know.